There are aviation stories that shock you. There are stories that scare you. And then there are stories that stay with you, not because of how they end, but because of what the pilot is forced to live through before the end even arrives. This is one of those stories. I have told many aviation stories over the years. Crashes, near misses, miracles, investigations. But this one is different. Because this story is not about metal failing. It's not about weather. It's not even about mistakes. It's about a pilot who stayed conscious, aware, and fully alive, while realizing, minute by minute, that survival was slipping away, and there was nothing left he could do to stop it. This story is not about heroics. Let me be clear from the start. This is not a brave captain saves the day story. There is no dramatic victory at the end of this segment. No cinematic rescue. What makes this story gut-wrenching is not what the pilot did. It's what he understood. Understood too early. Understood too clearly. And had to carry alone. The flight that should have been forgettable. It was supposed to be routine. Not a famous airline. Not a historic route. Not extreme weather. Just another flight added to a logbook already thick with thousands of hours. The pilot had flown this aircraft type so many times that the procedures lived in his muscle memory. Checklist items didn't require thought. Radio calls came automatically. This was the kind of flight pilots describe with one word: normal. And in aviation, normal is sacred. The cockpit state of mind. There's something people don't understand about pilots. Before emergencies, pilots are not tense. They're not dramatic. They're not constantly imagining disasters. They're calm, methodical, almost boring. That's how safety works. The pilot in this story was no different. Coffee nearby, autopilot engaged, system stable. His mind wasn't racing, it was quiet. And that quiet is exactly what made the next moment so devastating. The first sign. And why it didn't feel dangerous. The first sign of trouble didn't feel like danger. It felt like annoyance, a small indication, a parameter slightly off, a number that didn't quite make sense, not red, not flashing, not screaming, just wrong. Experienced pilots don't panic over small inconsistencies. They investigate, they cross-check, they monitor trends. And that's what he did. At that moment there was still time. Time to troubleshoot, time to plan, time to divert. Time, however, can be deceptive in aviation, because some failures don't accelerate. They wait. When the body knows before the brain. There's a point in every serious emergency where the pilot's body reacts before the mind fully understands. Heart rate changes, breathing shifts, a subtle tightening in the chest. Not fear, recognition. The pilot felt it before he could explain it. Something was wrong in a way that procedures didn't neatly describe, and that's when the cockpit stopped feeling routine and started feeling isolated. No one else can feel what he feels. This is the loneliest part of being a pilot. Passengers don't know. Air traffic control can't see it. The aircraft doesn't tell you everything. Only the pilot feels the combination of cues. The way the aircraft responds, the way systems behave under load, the way time suddenly feels compressed. This is where experience becomes a burden, because experience allows you to imagine outcomes before they happen. And sometimes, you don't like what you see. The moment of realization. There was a moment, brief, quiet, internal, when the pilot realized something critical. This was not a checklist problem. This was not a training scenario. This was not something that would resolve neatly. This was a situation where every option carried loss. Not necessarily death yet, but loss. Altitude, control, time, certainty. And certainty is what pilots rely on most. Why this story hurts. Here's why this story is gut-wrenching. The pilot did not lose consciousness. He did not black out. He did not descend into chaos. He remained aware. Aware of physics. aware of limitations, aware of what could and could not be done. And awareness, in this case, was cruel, because it meant he could calculate the margins shrinking and understand exactly when hope stopped being realistic. The silence. In the cockpit at a certain point, communication slows, not because there's nothing to say, but because saying it out loud makes it real. The cockpit became quieter, not empty, but focused. This is where pilots stop talking about possibilities and start acting on inevitabilities. And that transition is one of the hardest moments a human can experience. This is where we stop, for now, because this story cannot be rushed. What happens next involves decisions no human wants to make. Emotions pilots are trained to suppress. A level of mental endurance rarely discussed publicly. In segment 2, we will go deeper into the pilot's internal battle, the decisions that followed, and the moment he understood that professionalism would not save him, but dignity still mattered. This is not a story about how aviation works. It is a story about how a human holds together when the sky takes everything away. There is a moment in every true emergency when training stops feeling like guidance and starts feeling like weight. Because training teaches you how to solve problems. It does not teach you how to sit with the knowledge that the problem may be unsolvable. This is where the pilot in this story found himself, still flying, still conscious, still precise, and slowly realizing that the sky was no longer offering options, only consequences. The mindset shift. No one talks about pilots are trained to think in branches. If this happens, do that. If that fails, try this. If conditions change, reassess. But some situations collapse the decision tree into a single, brutal line. When that happens, the pilot's mindset changes, not outwardly, but internally. The focus narrows, not to panic, not to despair, to control. Because even when outcomes are limited, control still matters. The fight against false hope. False hope is dangerous in aviation. It delays action, it clouds judgment, it wastes time. The pilot felt the temptation of it. Maybe this will stabilize. Maybe the trend will reverse. Maybe there's more margin than I think. Experience taught him to resist that voice. Because hope without evidence is not optimism. It's denial. And denial kills pilots faster than fear ever does. The hardest calculation. At this stage, the pilot wasn't just flying the aircraft. He was running the numbers in his head. Altitude versus distance, performance versus degradation, time versus physiology. These aren't abstract calculations. They are personal. Because they don't just tell you what the aircraft can do, they tell you what you cannot escape. And at some point, the math stops offering solutions and starts delivering truths. The body under stress, but the mind still clear. People imagine extreme stress as chaos. In reality, it often produces unnatural clarity. Heart rate elevated, but steady. Breathing controlled. Hands calm on the controls. The pilot's mind was sharp, painfully sharp. Sharp enough to understand which systems were no longer trustworthy, which procedures were now irrelevant, which decisions would no longer change the outcome. This is the kind of clarity that no one wants, but pilots sometimes receive. Communication becomes careful words, matter more when time is short. The pilot chose his transmissions carefully, not because he was hiding anything, but because every word carried weight. He didn't dramatize, he didn't speculate, he didn't burden others with what he already knew. He communicated facts, and sometimes restraint is the last form of leadership. The isolation. No one sees. Even with voices on the radio, the cockpit can feel completely alone, because no one else can feel. The resistance in the controls, the subtle lag in response. The way the aircraft's behavior has changed, those sensations live only in the pilot's hands. And with that isolation comes a realization that is uniquely human. No one else can take this from me. Not the decision. Not the responsibility. Not the moment. The decision that wasn't a choice. Eventually, the pilot faced the decision people misunderstand the most. Not what to do, but how to do what must be done. When outcomes converge, choices don't disappear. They transform. The question becomes, do I act early or late? Do I prioritize control or comfort? Do I preserve the aircraft or preserve something else? These decisions are not written in manuals. They are written in values. The thought no pilot admits out loud. There is a thought pilots rarely share, even with each other. It's not fear of death. It's fear of losing professionalism at the end, of becoming frantic, of making a sloppy error, of letting the moment define you, instead of the other way around. The pilot in this story was determined of one thing. If this was going to end badly, it would end cleanly. Why this story is different. This isn't a story about last-second miracles. It's a story about composure when miracles don't arrive. The pilot didn't give up. He transitioned from problem-solving to damage control to legacy. And legacy in aviation is not about headlines. It's about doing the right thing when no one is watching, and when it no longer benefits you. The final preparation. As the situation evolved, the pilot began preparing, not externally, but internally, accepting limits, simplifying actions, reducing variables. This wasn't surrender. This was mastery. Because mastery includes knowing when the aircraft is no longer the thing you're trying to save. Time behaves strangely in the cockpit when the end becomes clear. Seconds stretch. Minutes compress. Thoughts arrive fully formed without panic. The pilot didn't experience the chaos people imagine. He experienced focus. Because once inevitability replaces uncertainty, the human mind does something remarkable. It stops searching for escape and starts searching for meaning. When the checklists end. There came a point when every checklist had been completed, not skipped, not abandoned, completed. Each item ticked off with the same precision it had always been done. And when the final checklist ended, something profound happened. There was nothing left to fix, only things left to manage. This is where flying becomes less about aviation and more about character. The silence that follows certainty. The cockpit grew quieter, not because radios went dead, but because unnecessary words fell away. The pilot didn't narrate his thoughts. He didn't dramatize the moment. He conserved energy and attention, like a mountaineer near the summit who knows the descent matters more than the view. Because dignity, at this point, was intentional. The body still flies the aircraft even as the mind accepted the outcome. The body kept flying. Hands steady, feet precise, eyes tracking what still mattered. This wasn't denial. It was discipline. Pilots are trained to fly the airplane until it can no longer be flown. Not until hope runs out. And hope had already been replaced by responsibility. The private moment, no recorder can capture. There is a moment every pilot owns alone, not transmitted, not recorded, not shared. It's the moment when you acknowledge, silently, that you have done everything you can. Not everything you wanted, everything you could. That distinction matters, because regret feeds on could have. Peace lives in I did. Thinking of others without distraction. Contrary to popular belief, the pilot didn't relive memories or imagine faces. That comes later, if there is later. In these moments, pilots think simply, keep it stable, keep it controlled, keep it clean. Why? Because control minimizes harm. Even when the outcome is fixed, how it happens still matters to others. That understanding is what separates training from instinct. The last decisions are about reduction. As options disappear, pilots simplify. Less configuration, fewer inputs, reduced variables. This is not giving up. It's respecting physics. Complexity is the enemy when margins vanish. So the pilot reduced the situation to what mattered most: attitude, speed, trajectory. Everything else became noise. The moment that breaks viewers. Here is where most people struggle with this story. Because the pilot did not cry. He did not shout. He did not panic. He remained present. And that presence, the calm acceptance paired with continued professionalism, is what makes this story unbearable to hear. Because it forces us to confront a truth we avoid. Courage is often quiet. What the data can't show. Flight data can show speed, altitude, control inputs it cannot show, acceptance, resolve, the internal decision to remain composed. Those things live only in human experience, and this pilot carried them alone. Why this story stays with you. This is not a story about failure. It's a story about how a human being behaves when stripped of outcomes. No victory, no rescue, no miracle. Just integrity carried to the last second. That's why pilots who hear this story don't talk much afterward, because they recognize themselves in it. The final seconds, without drama. The end did not come with cinematic music. It came with continued inputs, continued awareness, continued effort. The aircraft did not simply fall. It was flown as long as flight was possible. And that matters. After the event, after the radios fell silent and the data stopped moving, something else began. Interpretation. Because once an aircraft is gone, the story doesn't end. It changes hands. From the cockpit, to investigators, to families, to the quiet space where meaning is argued over, long after facts are known. This segment is not about what happened in the air. It's about what people do with it afterward. How investigators see composure. Investigators are trained to read data, not emotion. They study control inputs, timing, system behavior, deviations from procedure, but sometimes the data tells a story no checklist can explain. In this case, investigators noticed something unusual. There were no erratic inputs, no wild corrections, no last-second chaos. The data showed consistency, right to the end. To investigators, this meant one thing. The pilot remained functional. Not just conscious, functional. And that detail matters enormously, because it separates panic from purpose. The word no one uses in reports, official reports, avoid emotional language. They don't say brave. They don't say heroic. They don't say tragic unless necessary. But among professionals, another word circulates quietly: composed. It's one of the highest compliments a pilot can receive, especially posthumously. Composure means clear thinking under pressure, respect for procedure, even when outcomes are fixed, control without spectacle. It means the pilot didn't let the situation steal who they were. How families experience. A different story for families. Data is cold comfort. Graphs don't hug back. Timelines don't explain silence. What families search for is something else. Did they suffer? Did they panic? Were they afraid? And here's where this story becomes quietly powerful. Investigators were able to say, truthfully, that the pilot remained aware and in control. That he didn't lose himself. That his final minutes were not chaos, but effort. For many families, that matters more than the cause itself, because it replaces imagined terror with something gentler: dignity. Why professionalism matters after death. People sometimes ask, why does it matter how someone behaved at the end? It matters because behavior is the last thing we truly own. Circumstances can be unfair. Outcomes can be cruel. But behavior reflects values. And this pilot's behavior, steady, controlled, disciplined, became his final statement. Not spoken, demonstrated. The pilot community's quiet response. Pilots don't eulogize the way others do. They don't romanticize. They analyze. And when pilots talk about this story, they often say very little. a nod, a pause, a short sentence. He flew it to the end. In aviation culture, that sentence carries immense weight. It means he didn't abandon the aircraft. He didn't surrender to fear. He stayed present. It is one of the highest forms of respect. What this story teaches. Without teaching, this story is rarely used as a formal training case. There's no checklist takeaway, no procedure update, no technical fix. Instead, it's shared informally, mentor to student, captain to first officer, not as instruction, but as example. An example of how to be when outcomes are no longer negotiable. The difference between survival and meaning. Not every story ends with survival. Aviation acknowledges that quietly. But meaning can still exist without survival. Meaning exists in discipline under pressure, responsibility carried alone, humanity preserved. This pilot did not change physics, but he changed how the moment was lived. And that distinction matters. Why this story is hard to tell. This is why this is the most gut-wrenching pilot story I've ever told. Not because it's loud, not because it's graphic, not because it shocks, but because it forces us to confront a truth we don't like. Sometimes, the most powerful human acts happen when there is nothing left to gain, only something left to honor. Long after the investigation files were closed, long after the data stopped being debated, this story continued to live, quietly, persistently, inside the people who heard it, not because of how it ended, but because of how it was carried. This final segment isn't about the accident. It's about what remains after the accident no longer belongs to the headlines. How stories become legacies. Most aviation stories fade into categories: mechanical failure, weather, human error, procedural breakdown. This one didn't fit neatly anywhere because its defining feature wasn't cause, it was conduct. And conduct doesn't disappear when wreckage does. What pilots actually take from this story. Contrary to what people expect, pilots don't take fear from this story. They take orientation, a quiet mental note that says, if I'm ever there, this is how I want to be. Not fearless, not dramatic, not defiant, just present. This story doesn't teach pilots how to save an aircraft. It teaches them how to remain themselves when saving it is no longer possible. Why this story is shared quietly. You won't find this story in flashy training manuals. It's not printed in bold, it's shared. During late-night conversations, between instructors and students. In moments when someone asks, what happens if? And the answer isn't technical, it's human. Because some lessons can't be standardized. They can only be modeled. The difference between heroism and integrity. The world often celebrates heroism. Heroism is loud. Heroism has headlines. Heroism arrives with applause. Integrity is quieter. Integrity is doing the right thing when no one is watching. No one will praise you. The outcome won't change. This pilot's final minutes were not heroic in the cinematic sense. They were integral, and integrity lasts longer than heroism ever does. What families sometimes say years later, families often stop asking why. Why becomes unanswerable. Instead, they ask, who were they at the end? This story offers an answer that doesn't hurt as much as silence. They were focused, they were capable, they were themselves. And for many families, that matters more than cause or blame, because it replaces imagined chaos with character. Why this story still hurts to tell. It hurts because it strips away comforting illusions. The illusion that skill guarantees survival. Good decisions always win. Experience always buys time. It reminds us that sometimes the only thing left under our control is how we meet the moment. And that realization is uncomfortable, especially for people who value mastery. What this story asks of us. It doesn't ask us to fear flying. It doesn't ask us to distrust systems. It asks something more personal. Who are you when outcomes stop cooperating? Do you rush? Do you fragment? Do you lose yourself? Or do you simplify, steady, and carry responsibility without spectacle? That question extends far beyond aviation. The reason I keep telling this story, I keep telling it because it changes people quietly, not instantly, not loudly, but later, when someone faces pressure, loss, or inevitability, and remembers that composure is not the absence of emotion. It's the choice to act with dignity anyway. The final truth. This was the most gut-wrenching pilot story I've ever told, not because it ended badly, but because it ended honestly, with no illusions, no miracles, no performance, just a human being doing the job, until the job was finished.